So finally, I'd like to talk about conflict, the potential for conflict within families that parental care generates. I won't spend very long time going over this model, but this is a nice, very classic model of how two parents, if you've got biparental care in a system, like in many birds, there's extensive negotiations over who does the care. So if you imagine, Houston and Davis produced a model of how care should be divided up between two parents. So if you imagine a female's deciding how much effort to put into feeding offspring. Let's say it's all about feeding offspring. The female decides how much she's going to feed offspring, and then the male can respond by going, well, that's all right, well, I will feed that much in response to your level of feeding. And together we'll kind of muddle through. So they predicted that you would get something called incomplete compensation, which is that the female would decide how much to feed offspring, and the male will go, okay then, well, I'm going to do less than is enough to completely to make up 100% for the shortfall that you're doing. So unless the female decides to feed, I'm going to do less than you, is basically what the male says. So here is the line of -1, whereby the male completely compensates for the female's lack of effort. And he chooses to, under incomplete compensation, the male chooses to do less than totally compensating for the female. So if you imagine that a female, and then they mapped onto that exactly the same response. I'm going to do that again because I think that's cool. Here we go, look. Oh no, it's changed. Right, so now we're looking at the same graph of the male's response to the female's effort, but now we've got the female's response to the male's effort. So the female, the male is now deciding how much to do, and the female is deciding how much to respond. And under incomplete compensation, again, you get the same pattern whereby the female does less than is necessary to completely compensate for the male. So you've got these two curves describing the male and female effort in response to each other. So let's see how that works. Let's say the male decides to do that much effort, and the female therefore decides to do that much, putting her here on the graph. Then, in response to what the female is doing, the male incompletely compensates to respond, and that puts him here. So he's reducing his effort accordingly now that the female is doing something. And the female decides to then increase her effort, but not by very much. So you get a bit more there. And the female is now here, and the male decides to respond. And you can see how we kind of spiral towards a situation where they're both doing the effort where the lines cross. Okay, so and that is a stable strategy, because either side of that line, they're going to go back to this point here. So now consider what happens if we reverse the lines and we kind of do more than if individuals fully compensate or if they overcompensate for their partner's effort. Now, if a male chooses to do that much, a female will choose to go higher than him, and then the male is then selected to reduce his effort to nothing, and you end up with only the male caring. The female is selected to reduce her effort to nothing, and so you get only the male caring. Similarly, if the male chose to do this much, the female overcompensates, and you get only the female caring. That's an unstable situation. So if parents overcompensate for each other's effort, then the other one will just bugger off and say, all right, then you do it. Whereas if you get incomplete compensation, then they're both selected to do a stable amount of care. That's basically what that model says. So biparental care is only stable when the parents use incomplete compensation. There's mixed evidence for this. Camilla Hines did a very cunning experiment where she did a playback of chicks begging in Great Tits, and she watched the parents coming and going to the nest, and she played back the chicks begging only when one parent was there in order to try and manipulate their effort. Unexpectedly, the other parent increased their work rate. What's going on? You'd expect them to reduce their work rate in terms of in accordance with incomplete compensation. So parents may also use the work rate of the other parent as like a cue for how much the offspring need feeding. That was what she concluded from that. So that's conflict among parents. There's also potential conflict within a family. So if you imagine a parent who, for the purposes of argument, is singly mated, the relatedness that this parent is going to have to her offspring is always going to be 0.5. You're always 0.5 related to your offspring. So therefore, she is selected to allocate equal amounts of care to each of her offspring. And she's also 0.5 related to any of her future offspring too. So she's selected to allocate equal amounts of care to all her current offspring and her future offspring. But any given offspring is related by 1 to itself, but by 0.5 to the rest of the group. So offspring are selected to grab more parental care than the parent is willing to give, basically. So there's always going to be selection for offspring to overclaim parental care. And that results in sibling conflict within families. Good example of this is these blue-footed boobies that we met in the second year. They have 2 eggs. The first gets an extra 4 days of incubation, as we learned last year. And so the older chick is basically fed until it's sated, and the younger one can starve to death. And if the older one is struggling, it will basically peck the younger chick until it stops begging and starves. So it's a kind of a clear example of sibling conflict. Another good example is in coots, where the offspring are kind of got these kind of weird, like here is a parent coot, but the offspring have these crazy red and orange heads. The parents will tend to feed the brightest one, the one with the best quality. And there was a good experiment by Lyon et al. Where they make all the chicks just black by shaving them. So they physically shaved the coot chicks. And if you shave them all, they grow normally. But if you shave half the chicks, then the shaved chicks are fed less, and they grow. They have poor growth. And there's a really dark side to coot parental care, which there's a good David Attenborough video. There's not time for us to watch it now, unfortunately. But if you follow that link, follow it at your peril if you're emotionally sensitive, because it's quite gut-wrenching video about coot parental care. Whoops. Then we have quite obvious examples of parent-offspring conflict in humans, where toddlers will throw tantrums. That's quite a good example of conflicts of interest between parents and offspring about the amounts of parental care to give. Yes. Finally, we get some genetic examples of conflict within a family over parental care. So this concept of genomic imprinting you may or may not have met before, but it's genes which are expressed only when they're inherited from one parent. So that creates a potential for conflict because a female tends to, because she's sure of, she is certain of maternity of all of her offspring, will favour allocating equal amounts of parental care to each of her offspring. But the male will favour the ones which contain his genes. So the males, because he's not quite 100% certain that all of the female's offspring are going to be sired by him, then his alleles tend to select for over extracting more parental care than the female is prepared to give. So it sets the stage for a tug of war. And you can see that in a gene called IgA, I think it's insulin-like growth factor in mice, where the copy inherited from the father and mother have different effects. If you knock out the allele from, if you knock out using a mutant the IGF2 allele inherited from the mother, then you get, no, is that right? Effectively, if you knock out the allele inherited from the mother, you get a giant mouse. And if you knock out the allele inherited from the father, you get a dwarf mouse. Because there is a tug of war going on over the amount of nutrients extracted from the mother. So go and check out that paper for a more in-depth explanation of how that works. How is the parent-offspring conflict resolved, and the conflict within a family resolved? Well, there's a suggestion that parent-offspring co-evolution tends to result in a compromise, and so a situation where parents tailor the traits of offspring to their requirements. So, for example, if offspring benefit from being big in an environment that the parent can, if the parent senses that you're in an environment where offspring do well by being big, then she can create the circumstances for big offspring to be more successful. For example, in birds, that can be through different amount and quality of yolk in the eggs. So what Camilla Hind et al. Did was to differentially feed groups of canaries, and then once you've created situations where there are good and poor conditions for the different families, then cross-fostered the eggs, kind of swapped the eggs among nests, and found that chicks from the well-fed mothers would tend to beg harder. So they've gained a cue, some kind of cue from, regardless of which nest they ended up in. So they've got some kind of cue from their yolk that says, hang on, we're being fed really well. You can expect a really good environment, so beg harder. As opposed to offspring from a poor environment, which beg less hard. And then there's evidence also, again, for co-adaptation between parent and offspring. So, again, the same paper found that offspring do best when they come from their own nest. So this here along the x-axis is the difference in the intensity of begging between your natal nest and the one you end up in. So if there's, and 0 is here. So if there's a high difference, even if you're in a nest where other chicks are begging less than you do less well than if you had grown up in your own nest. And if you grow up in a nest where chicks are begging harder than you, obviously you're going to do less well. So this is good evidence that parents will tailor the competitiveness of their chicks to the environment that they're likely to receive. What happens if the conflict is not resolved? So there are a couple of cases, and this is especially results from situations where parents ended up caring for offspring of a different species. So you get situations like brood parasitism, like cuckoo behaviour, where individuals will lay eggs in the nests of other species, exploiting loopholes in their kin recognition systems. Things like these cuckoos, where individuals end up feeding these monstrous chicks that just keep demanding more. This Claire Spottiswoode wrote a lovely paper on brood parasites in honey guides, a honey guide which will parasitise the nests of other birds which lay eggs underground, and they come out with this hook on their. The chick comes out with this horrible hook on their beak, which they use to murder the chick of the other offspring, of the other species, and then grab all the parental care for themselves. This leads to absolutely epic parasite-host arms races, which are detailed in Becky Kilner and Naomi Langmore's paper here. That's a really cool. There's lots of really cool evolutionary stories in this paper here. And then, like final example of unresolved conflict is slave making in ants. So ants will raid the broods of other species and bring them back to their own nest, and then those individuals hatch out thinking they're in a nest of their own species, and they will use them as a supplemental workforce, which then raise the larvae of their new hosts. So this is exploiting the parental care behaviour of another species. There's some beautiful, beautiful examples of this, and you can have a look at the biology of those species in this Vittori and Heinze paper.